Morning, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the steering committee for inviting me to give this talk. I've been to a lot of these global forum meetings in my time. I don't think I've actually ever given a presentation at one. So it's a great privilege to get to speak to you all. I'll try not to break the equipment. So health research has brought humanity tremendous benefits. Thanks to medical research, we have vaccines that can protect children from infectious diseases that once killed millions every year. Thanks to public health research, this is the famous pump whose handle was removed on Jon Snow's advice to stop a cholera epidemic. Thanks to public health research, we understand now how diseases spread and how sanitation can stop them. Health research means we can ameliorate pain, replace organs, treat infections, correct people's vision, much more. Thanks to medical research, effective vaccines were developed for COVID-19 within a year. And science has, hopefully, the potential to bring lots more benefits for health and well-being. But the benefits of scientific progress have not been even. What health research is conducted, and to whom the benefits from health research flow, has tended to track the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. So back in 1990, a seminal report from the Commission on Health Research for Development, which identified what came to be known as the 1090 gap, a gross mismatch between the burden of illness, which is overwhelmingly in the third world, and investment in health research, which is overwhelmingly focused on the health problems of the industrialized countries. Now, since that report, much has changed. Greater resources have been devoted to research in low and middle income countries. There's far more collaboration internationally, and there's far more awareness of the ethical issues that sort of collaboration entails. In addition, the changing burden of disease in low and middle income countries, so that non-communicable diseases are now the greatest part of the burden of disease, means that we can't simply divide health problems into the health problems experienced by more wealthy and less wealthy countries. But it's clear that there is still a problem. So let me illustrate this problem with the case of neglected diseases. And we have comprehensive data on investments in neglected disease research from the annual GFBR reports. They define neglected diseases as diseases whose burden disproportionately affects people in low and middle income countries, for which there's no suitable treatment or preventive intervention, and there's no commercial market to stimulate research and development by industry. So according to their latest figures, the total funding for research and development into products for neglected diseases, and that means public, philanthropic, for-profit investment, is about $4 billion a year. And that is for diseases that are responsible for roughly $325 million a year, disability-adjusted life years, which is about 13% of the global disease burden. And to emphasize, this is a disease burden that is experienced by people who are among the very worst off in the world. Okay, now $4 billion is a lot of money. But compare that to the global health research budget. Now, figures on how much is spent on research worldwide are actually incredibly hard to find. There's no GFBR report for non-neglected diseases. I'm confident, though, that the global research budget is well in excess of $200 billion a year. The US National Institutes of Health has a budget itself of $48 billion, of which it says about 94% is spent on research activities. 20 largest biopharma companies claim to have spent about $140 billion a year on R&D, and of course there are many more funders in addition to these. So, the $4 billion that's spent on neglected diseases is less than 2% of global spending on health research. And that seems unjust, just as the 1090 gap seemed unjust. So global research resources are maldistributed. That much, I think, is clear. But it seems to me it's not at all obvious exactly how they should be distributed. So should the global allocation of funds just reflect the global burden of disease? Are private funders on the hook as well, or should we just be talking about public funders? And crucially, what should individual organizations or research institutions be doing? For example, what do we say to a funder who says, yeah, this does seem like a problem. What should I in particular be doing? What should I in particular be doing research on? But this is why big picture priority setting is needed. We need to answer these questions, right, about how funds for health research should be allocated. And we need to do so in a way that is systematic and that's principled. Now, let me turn to the focus of this talk and this meeting, which is the ethics of health research priority setting. I want to say something first about why we have to talk about ethics when we talk about research priority setting. And I'm sure that all of us in this room think that ethics is important. Others might be skeptical. And I think it's really valuable to see why thinking about ethics in priority setting is unavoidable. This is my generic picture for when an ethically important division is being made. Originally, I thought it was a cake, and therefore it was very convincing that it was ethically important. I think, in fact, it might be a quiche. In which case, it's really not clear who is going to be demanding it. Anyway, the illustration hopefully is clear. Okay, so in health research priority setting, in its most general sense, we're deciding, or perhaps we're recommending to others, about how to allocate a scarce and valuable resource. We're saying, for example, how funds ought to be allocated among different diseases. Or we're saying which research questions are the most important research questions for us to answer. The resource is scarce because we have limited money, limited researcher time, and so on. And it's valuable because research can, and sometimes does, lead to important scientific breakthroughs that can benefit human health. Now, we can never know the results of research ahead of time, right? That's what makes research priority setting technically very hard. We don't know which scientific studies are going to yield the most valuable results. If we knew those sorts of things, then probably we wouldn't have to do research at all. But we're not entirely ignorant. Right? It's not entirely random who benefits from medical research. We know, for example, that if we did invest more funds into treatments and diagnostic tests for dengue fever, then we will be more likely, in a few years' time, to have more effective treatments and better diagnostic tests. So, how our scarce resource gets allocated predictably affects which populations benefit. And that means that in research priority setting, effectively, we're deciding or we're recommending who should receive important benefits when not everyone can receive those benefits. And the question, who should benefit, is an ethical question. In fact, that's a question about justice. So I think there is a simple but very important lesson here. And it's that the ethics of research priority setting is not just about the process of priority setting, it's also about the fairness of the results. So it's not like priority setting involves carrying out some sort of technical exercise where while we're carrying out that exercise, we also want to make sure that people behave correctly. No, there are values that are being expressed through the exercise. and there are values that are being expressed in the results of the exercise. So the ethical and the technical aspects of research priority setting are necessarily intertwined. So, we need to engage in health research priority setting. We need to involve ethics in our priority setting. Who is this we? Who is it that sets health research priorities, and who should it be? Now, when I point out the global disparities in the research that's getting done, I'm pointing out that the overall allocation of research resources is inequitable, it's unjust. But there is no single global body that allocates research resources. So there's not just one actor who's acting unjustly in deciding how the research resources are going to get spread around. What research gets done depends on the decisions by multiple actors, right? This includes government agencies like ministries of health. It includes international organizations like the World Health Organization. It includes funders, public, philanthropic, for-profit, who are deciding how to spend money. It includes research institutions like universities, whose incentive structures play a huge role in deciding what science gets done. And it includes individual researchers who, despite the need to apply for grants and publish papers, have a great deal of latitude about exactly what questions they decide to answer within the limits of what's fundable. Spent a long time on that diagram, by the way. That's about half of my preparation. Thank you. So all of these actors, all of the people that I just mentioned, are allocating a scarce resource because all of them are making decisions about what research gets done. Most of the time, though, they don't think about their decisions as constituting or resulting from priority setting. The value judgments about what research to do and therefore what populations to benefit are sometimes implicit, as it is for researchers who just pursue the science that they find interesting, or for funders who say what we're going to do is we're going to fund just on the basis of the best science. Or the priority setting is conducted in ways that are not systematic and principled, as it is when priorities are based on what people in positions of power find salient or politically expedient. Now, since they're allocating scarce and valuable resources, I think there is an obligation to make this implicit priority setting explicit. And I think there is an obligation to carry out the explicit priority setting in ways that are guided by ethical principles. So, who should set priorities? Well, governments, international organizations, funders, research institutions, researchers. Everyone who is allocating this scarce resource of health research. Now, on the one hand, there are lots of individuals and entities who are making decisions about what research gets done, and they may not think of themselves as involved in priority setting, but they should. On the other hand, when priorities are being set, it may not be only those individuals and entities who ought to be involved. Attending to some obvious power disparities should illuminate why other parties should also sometimes be involved. The majority of research funding comes from high-income country institutions or multinational companies. The global governance regime that exists to, for example, incentivize the development of medicines that can be patented is a global governance regime that heavily favors the interests of the wealthy, that is, those who are able to afford patented medicines. Meanwhile, patients, families, carers, community members, clinicians, and often low and middle income country researchers, they frequently don't get to decide what research is conducted. And unsurprisingly, this leads to research priorities that are skewed from what we might think is a globally just allocation of scientific resources. So, who should be setting priorities? Well, I think there is a case to be made for involving all the groups that I just mentioned. And that case is based on the importance to these groups of what research actually gets carried out. They're stakeholders in research because they're substantially affected by what gets investigated and how. Here is a graphic. Don't worry about reading the details of the text here. It's a graphic from a paper by Bridget Pratt and colleagues who were looking at priority setting for health systems research. And they identified 3 different categories of stakeholder who should be involved: producers of research, users of research, and beneficiaries of research. And we can probably think of good reasons why individuals from all these groups might have a stake in exactly what research gets conducted. And we can also no doubt think of ways in which representatives of these groups might have important perspectives on research needs and opportunities that it will be valuable for those carrying out research to know about. Okay, before I move on to talking about how research priorities should be set, let me just summarize what I've said so far. I've argued that many individuals and organizations are in fact allocating research resources, and they're therefore engaged in priority setting. They ought to do that priority setting explicitly and guided by ethical principles. But there are also many people who are not typically involved in decisions about the allocation of research resources, for whom there are also ethical reasons to include. So then, how should research priorities be set? I'm just going to answer all the questions, I promise. Now, there's been a lot of work on how research priorities should be set. Over the last few decades, a number of methods that have been developed for carrying out formal research priority setting exercises. These include methods developed by the Council on Health Research for Development, co-RED, the James Lind Alliance, the Child Health and Nutrition Research Initiative, and many others. These formal methods mainly aim to guide national priority setting exercises and the setting of research agendas for specific patient populations. And I'm not going to attempt to summarize them. There are people here who have been involved in developing these methods and applying these methods, much more expert than me, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them about their experiences with these methods. Now, our topic for this meeting, it includes the ethics of carrying out these exercises, but also more than that. So decisions get made about what research will get done that are not part of those exercises, and those decisions are open still to ethical scrutiny. So, for example, among the case studies that are presented, we're going to hear about ethical challenges with collaborations between research groups and who controls those research agendas. And, as I've already argued, there are all sorts of individuals and entities that are not explicitly doing research priority setting, but are still making decisions about the allocation of scarce resources, and so ought to think of themselves as doing that and ought to be doing it explicitly. So, let me turn to the ethics of formal and of less formal research priority setting. Ethics in this area requires us to think about both process and about substantive requirements. Substantive requirements including the goals at which we aim, the process being how we reach those goals. And I think that we cannot have one without the other. We can't know what would be a fair, effective process without having some sort of concept of the sort of outcome that we want that process to bring about. In the same way as we wouldn't be able to design the process for, say, a fair trial without having some idea about what we thought the just outcome of a trial would be. And, as I suggested a few minutes ago, the outcomes of priority setting, how resources get distributed, can clearly be just or unjust because they represent a just or an unjust allocation of resources. But we won't get to a just allocation without the right sort of process. Decades of experience suggest the process has to be one that meets certain ethical criteria as well. So, for example, criteria to do with including stakeholders in decision-making, aiming to mitigate power imbalances, and so on. We can't design a fair process without a concept of a just outcome. We're not going to reach a just outcome without using a fair process. Now, there's going to be a lot of discussion over the next 2 days about both the process and the substantive criteria that should be used. I'm just going to make a couple of very general points about each. Regarding fair processes, first, it's vital to have appropriate and meaningful inclusion of the various stakeholders in the research enterprise. This means that members of diverse groups should generally be included, but people should not be involved just for the sake of it. That leads to tokenism and box ticking around inclusion. Inclusion that won't improve decisions, but will waste resources. Instead, we should decide which groups to include and how to include them on the basis of the reasons for including each group. In other words, to know who should be included and how they should be involved, we must know why it is that they're being involved. So, for example, we want to know which existing antivirals have the best prospect of being effective if repurposed for a novel disease. Well, clearly, we're going to need to involve scientific experts in our priority setting. And we're going to need to involve them in a way that allows us to synthesize their collective knowledge about the subject area. Or perhaps we're setting priorities for irritable bowel syndrome. Well, one thing we might want to know is, what are the aspects of that disease that have the biggest impact on patients' lives? In which case, we're going to want to involve patients in our priority setting. And again, we're going to need to think about how to involve them in order to find out exactly what it is that really matters to them. Right? So how to involve them in ways so that their voices are not drowned out by others, so that the views that we get from patients are actually a fair representation of the different patient experiences and so on. Okay, we're going to hear a lot more about this over the next couple of days and from people who are much more knowledgeable about it than I am. The other aspect of the ethics of research priority setting is the substantive criteria by which allocation decisions are made. So, for example, the criteria that are used to compare or to score different research options. And I think we can't avoid making substantive ethical judgments. Some people seem to want to punt all of the value judgments and just let the people decide. Sometimes propose that we can set up a fair and inclusive process. We just then let those who are participants in the process decide what are the substantive criteria going to be by which we're going to judge different research options, by which we're going to decide which research options should be the ones that get given highest priority. But first, to do that is already to make a value judgment, right? It's not as though we already know and have agreement on what counts as a fair process, but we don't know and we don't agree on what counts as a just outcome, right? Saying that whatever decision results from this process is a fair way to allocate research resources, that already is making a value judgment and one that's open for discussion. So either way, you're going to make value judgments. Second, I think there are really important substantive questions that we should be discussing. So, for example, what benefits count? What equity means in this context? What we should do about rare diseases? And I'll say something in a moment about some of the hard questions that I think we should be thinking about. In discussing and debating those questions, I think, optimistically, we can make progress. So I don't think we should try to avoid making substantive ethical judgments about what would be a just allocation of resources. I don't think we should try to replace them with more process. Instead, better to engage hard questions with intellectual humility. So not assuming that we're correct, assuming that we're correct without doing the work of having difficult discussions about these substantive questions. And then we can design better processes that help us get to the outcomes that we think matter. Here's one substantive criterion that's commonly used as a justification for the processes that are put in place. It concerns the goal of health research priority setting. And here's the goal as stated by the authors of the Combined Approach Matrix. They write, "The goal of priority setting in research is to identify neglected areas and invest in research that will result in improved interventions for the populations in greatest need." Now, some version of this goal is stated in very many priority setting documents, and I think it's a very sensible goal. The underlying criterion is one that I think of in terms of social value. And that term, social value, is a catch-all term for the benefits that are generated by the research. Importantly, those benefits should not be valued just for how large they are, right? Not just for valuing for the impact on the welfare of populations, but also for how far they're benefits for populations who are in greatest need. So, there is an agreed upon substantive criterion for health research priority setting, which is that the primary aim is to allocate resources to increase the social value of research. And we can break down the social value of research into three components. First, the probability that a research study is going to be, or a research program is going to be successful. For example, that it might lead to a change in patient care. Second, the magnitude of the benefit that results. So, for example, how many patients would be benefited by this change in patient care. And third, the extent to which providing those benefits to patients would reduce inequality. So, how badly off are those patients? Who would benefit from the change in patient care? So research studies are more valuable when the knowledge they generate is expected to lead to greater benefits and when those benefits flow to people who are more disadvantaged. Now, this widespread agreement on the goal of research priority setting being some version of generating social value does not mean that substantive ethical questions are resolved. Far from it. There are many questions we don't have agreement on and which matter for priority setting. Here are a handful that puzzle me. Should more common diseases get higher priority? You can benefit more people with an intervention for a more common disease. But then it might seem unfair to those people who are suffering from rarer diseases, orphan diseases, as they're sometimes called. I do not know the answer to this question. Do non-health benefits matter? That is, should we value research only because it improves health or because of other health effects, other effects on human flourishing or economic benefits that result from research? How should equity be understood? I stated it in very general terms by mentioning people who are more disadvantaged or mentioning inequality, but those sorts of generalizations are not enough if we're actually going to measure equity, right? Operationalize it so that we can set priorities according to the effects of research on people who are more disadvantaged. How should historical wrongs be taken into account? So, for example, should former colonial powers be investing in more health research to benefit people in countries that were former colonies, or indeed other countries that they've wronged? All of these questions, I think, hard questions, questions that need to be answered if we're going to do research priority setting right, questions that I definitely do not think I know the answers to. Okay, so I'm going to close with a couple of words about the allocation of resources to priority setting and how that matters ethically, or priority setting and priority setting, as I've termed it. I don't think that's going to catch on as a title. So research priority setting typically is a multi-stage process. It requires the use itself of scarce resources. In particular, if an organization carries out one of the formal priority setting exercises that I mentioned earlier, That can be an investment of an enormous amount of time and resources by government officials, researchers, patients, community members, and so on. Those people in the room who are familiar with carrying out these exercises will know what I mean. But those resources are scarce, and at some level, we are allocating resources to priority setting that could be used for carrying out valuable research. So even by engaging in priority setting, we are priority setting. And I think that this means that there are further ethical obligations. As I argued at the start of the talk, there are obligations to set priorities and to do so in accordance with ethical principles. But that obligation, those obligations, they exist only because they're expected to guide the allocation of research resources. If they're not going to do that, then the priority setting itself is going to be a waste. So we have an obligation to try to put priorities into practice, which means that those who carry out priority setting exercises have ethical obligations to disseminate their results, and if they have the power, to implement the results. And for those who are making decisions about research, it means there's an obligation to seek out the results of well-run priority setting exercises and use them to guide decisions about what research projects to pursue or what funding calls to put out. Okay, in closing, I want to just repeat a couple of themes that I touched on in this talk. First, I hope that I've shown that ethics is an integral component of health research priority setting. It's not just important in the sense that we should carry out research priority setting in an ethical manner, but priority setting itself necessarily involves value judgments, which we can scrutinize. Second, there are many individuals and entities who make decisions about what research gets done. I've talked a lot about we in this presentation. When I say we, I don't just mean governments and research funders. I mean literally you and me. We all have obligations to allocate the resources that we control or that we influence in a way that is fair and ethical. Third, just outcomes and fair processes are inextricably intertwined. Just outcomes require fair processes. Designing a fair process requires a conception of a fair outcome. So we should engage then with both how to design a fair process and what substantive criteria we should be using to allocate research resources. And fourth, we should not stop with priority setting as an exercise. There is an ethical obligation to disseminate and to use the results of priority setting. It's valuable only if it affects what research gets done. Finally, I hope that the discussions of this meeting will help us all to learn about how we can improve health research priority setting. Even if we can't answer all these questions perfectly, we can get a little better. And I'm looking forward to 2 days of ethical discussion and from learning from every one of you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. I think that helps set the scene and the difficult questions we've got ahead. We've probably got a couple of minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions on the back of that. Otherwise, we've got 2 days to ask Joe questions and to discuss this topic. Any burning issues off the back of that talk? So Netta and then the lady behind you afterwards. I'll take 2 questions in the interest of time. So then.
Good morning.
Please say your name at this point because we don't know each other yet.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Good morning. Annette Ridd is my name. I work at the National Institutes of Health. Thanks, Joe, for a great talk. I wanted to point out one area or another complexity in the priority setting area and see if you have any thoughts on that, which is that in order to set priorities, you need to know a lot of things, namely all of the people who are conducting research, what are they doing, and you know, where do you fit in so that the thing as a whole works. And not only do you need to do that at the present, but ideally you need to project it into the future because your research is going to deliver results only into the future. That would be a huge task for an individual organization. So how do you think about setting priorities about, you know, what to engage with realistically as an organization in terms of the information you need to gather to do a good job at setting priorities?
Yeah, great.
And then hold that. We'll take the second question.
I won't
So
remember the
enough
first
time.
one. This is not saving us any time.
Go.
Hi, good morning. I will be quickly. My name is Andrea from Brazil. My question is, how can a public health research be prioritized health face of the pharmaceutical industry power in the industry health research?
No, sorry, could you repeat the question? My apologies.
I will read. How can public health research be prioritized in the face of the pharmaceutical industry's power to induce health research?
Okay,
Yeah.
this is the challenge because this is the short answer, not the long answer. Because we've
Okay.
got 2 minutes.
Yeah, great. Annetta, thanks for the question. I actually removed a part of this talk which was about the obligations to collaborate and to coordinate, which I think are very important. I think especially for the larger organizations in the health research space, coordination of their activities is incredibly important. There are a few groups that are trying to do that, for example, among funders to coordinate what funding is being conducted. And I think that's an important activity. I think the data that is needed is something that we should not be expecting the individual entities that conduct priority setting to be collecting themselves when we're talking about the big picture data, right? This is one of the reasons why it's valuable, for example, for organizations like the WHO to be gathering data on what research is being done and what research they expect to be needed. So the Global Observatory of the WHO on Research and Development, is that what it's called? I think it's a great resource, even if a very incomplete resource on what research is getting done. Segueing into the elephant in the room, right? One of the things we don't know and would be really, really helpful to know is exactly what different for-profit companies are doing. Because that's such a huge proportion of the research that gets done. We don't know, for the most part, what it is that these companies are doing, and that will be really helpful also for coordinating research efforts. And I don't think that I am going to be able to offer any helpful words of wisdom regarding how the mouse of public health research can combat the elephant of pharma research. I think this is a huge problem, and I'm hoping that people in this room will have words of wisdom about that problem, right? Just in terms of sheer resources, I don't expect us to be able to prioritize in the sense of doing more of one type of research than another, right? But it is an important challenge how to get decision makers to recognize what's the value to their populations of research like public health research that can have enormous health benefits for relatively small investments, rather than just looking at the amount of funding that is being directed to a particular form of research, as you might have with the for-profit pharma industry. But that is a problem that is way above my pay grade, as they say.
You'd join me in thanking Joe, because we have to move on.